Thank you, Jessica, for being with us tonight.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Yeah, we're super excited to have this Startup Sunday session recorded with you. And just to give our audience a brief overview of Jessica, Jessica is a business attorney, and her focus is on helping the startup community and business owners overcome the obstacles and the challenges that they face so that they can focus on building their business. And with that, I'll pass it on to you, Jessica, to give our listeners a brief intro about yourself.
Yeah, so that's spot on. I own a business-oriented law firm here in Dallas, Texas. My license is in Texas. I always like to say that, especially when I start talking about legal advice, because especially when it comes to businesses, the laws do vary by state. But I own a firm based in Dallas. I work mostly with early to mid-stage companies. I do have some later stage companies, but I tend to like to develop relationships with business owners early on in their businesses so that we can get everything all settled and organized, and really we just grow the business after that. I work primarily with technology companies, but I have clients in every industry known to man. I say my practice is about 70% technology app-based work, 20% emerging technologies. So that can be anything from artificial intelligence, AR, VR, esports, things like that. And then 10% traditional small businesses, which really like runs the spectrum in terms of what it is, contractors and salons and artists and all sorts of stuff. So anything not tech-based.
That's really awesome.
Yeah,
Great.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So you got that entrepreneur background yourself.
Yeah.
How is running a law firm?
You know, just like any other business, it has its ups and downs. There are a lot of benefits to it. I get to pick my clients. I only have to work with people that are passionate about what they do and that I really believe in, which I love, because so many attorneys, I feel like, you know, I see them at events and they're like, oh, this client, that client, they're just terrible to deal with, blah, blah, blah. And I love my clients and I really believe in what they're doing. So that's great. But you know, I like it because it helps me understand where my clients are coming from. When I go into my clients and I say, you know, in an ideal world, these are the 6 legal things you need to take care of. I also understand cash on hand problems, and I understand having to prioritize things. And, you know, these aren't billion-dollar companies that I'm working with, at least not at the beginning. These are early stage companies that really don't have that much funding in some situations, and it would be great if we could get all their legal concerns taken care of, but sometimes that takes time because it's either pay me or pay their rent that month. And legal is important, but having a place to live is also very important. So
that's very true. And for this session, there's so many things that we could ask you, but specifically we wanted to focus and narrow down the topic of this particular session to forming and establishing a business. So the basics, the 101 legal advice that you would give to companies. So let's go ahead and get started with our first basic question, which is, at what point should entrepreneurs seek legal advice and talk to a lawyer?
I personally think the earlier the better. And the caveat to that is there are a lot of attorneys out there who will not charge you for your initial consultation. Or there are a lot of opportunities to go and talk to attorneys at public events or free events. So I think it's important to consult an attorney as early on as possible, but that doesn't necessarily translate to pay an attorney $500 to meet with them for an hour immediately, because I don't think everyone needs that. And there are, you know, the legal industry, just like any other industry, you have to find a practitioner that fits your business and fits your personality. And there are attorneys that charge, you know, $200 an hour, and there are attorneys that charge $1,500 an hour. And price shouldn't necessarily be the determining factor, but the question is, how much is that person willing to work with you? How much experience do they actually have in the industry that you're working in? And what do you feel like that relationship will look like going forward? Because it really is a long-term relationship. So talk to them as soon as possible and bring them on board as soon as possible, and find opportunities, free opportunities to get access to that sort of education if you're not in a position to be able to pay an attorney right now.
Right. And you brought up one really good point about you can just meet the attorneys at public events. And that's something
Yeah.
that I personally hadn't thought about. You know, when I go
Yeah.
networking, I don't particularly go looking for lawyers.
Specific
So
one.
that's, yeah, that's a very good point. But what is some other avenues or channels where people can try to find attorneys or legal advice?
Yeah, so the number one thing I always discourage people from doing is going online to some sort of legal site. Like, well, I'm not going to name any specific ones, but we can all think of a very popular one that provides legal services online. And it's not that those services do not have a place in the legal industry, they certainly do. But especially with inexperienced first time or young business owners, it's important to meet with someone in person, because it's not just about conveying legal information. It's also about that counseling relationship. My official title is counselor at law. That's what my license says, whichever side of my head it's on. And what does that mean? It means my job is not to walk into a room and tell you, you need to be an LLC instead of a C Corp, and you need to set up like this, and you need to do that. I'm not dictating decisions here, or at least that's not how it should be. Really what I'm doing is listening to what my clients want and counseling them based on my experience in the industry to help hopefully decrease their personal asset liability and increase their potential successes and positioning going forward so that they can be as successful as possible. That was a tangent. To answer your question, where do you find lawyers? We're literally all over the place. Maybe that's just my perspective because I know a lot of lawyers, but almost any networking event, meeting lawyers at industry specific networking events is also great, because then you know that they have experience in your industry, which is really, really important. I see a lot of times young business owners will be like, oh, we had this document drafted by a family friend who's an attorney. And it literally takes me half a second looking at that document to be like, this person does not practice business law. Right. This person's probably like a family attorney or a criminal defense attorney or something like that. And that's not to say they're not competent. They very much are. If I stepped into a courtroom to do a divorce, it would be an absolute disaster. No one wants that. And the same thing with documents. If you don't deal with it, you just really have no concept for what you're doing, whether your license allows you to do it or not. So that's something else to keep in mind. But yeah, meeting them in person, looking for people on like LinkedIn or something like that, that are active and post a lot of articles. Social media platforms. Lawyers are kind of starting to get into social media, so you may find a couple of them. Avvo, avvo.com. I'm personally not a huge fan of Avvo. It's essentially a site for connecting attorneys with potential clients. I would steer clear of looking at the sponsored listings, but there are a lot of opportunities for attorneys to like write responses to questions and things on there, and you can look based on question, and that's a good way to kind of get a feel for someone's substance and their experience in the practice area.
Very helpful. I'm definitely gonna look up Avvo. Never heard of it before.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've never heard of it before. Not to say that I've actually done research and never got connected to Avvo. It's just like it's never come up.
That's so interesting.
So Jessica, tell us about, as founders, I feel like they have so many priorities going on, and you know, their focus is mainly, depending on whether it's a product or service, is to get that thing off the ground, whatever that is.
Yeah.
But at what point should founders form a legal entity?
Well, the lawyer in me wants to say immediately, the sooner the better. And I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of doing that, because like we were kind of talking previously and ahead of time, I recognize that you're not always going to have the cash on hand to form the entity right when you want to. Maybe you need to wait until you get a little bit of revenue coming in before you do that. So here's some things to keep in mind. If you are doing a bunch of work before you form the entity, one of the big issues that you run into is that all of that work that was done before the entity was formed then has to be assigned to the entity for the entity to own it. So and I'm going to use a lot of technology examples just because it's easiest, but it can apply to any field. If I have a co-founder and we are developing an app for a cell phone, and at some point we, 6 months in, the app's almost fully developed, we actually form the LLC. That's great. And theoretically, in our operating agreements, we can assign everything we do from that point forward to the company automatically. But the problem is going to be all that work we've already done then has to be assigned to the entity for the company to own it. And that's an issue that I see a lot of founders run into. They go to do a round of fundraising, or they go to sell some of their product, and they realize the company doesn't actually own a lot of that intellectual property or own a lot of that product, because it hasn't been properly assigned. So the earlier you form the entity, the more you avoid that situation and having to deal with that additional paperwork. You also avoid similar issues with tangible assets. So if you buy a bunch of product prior to forming the entity and something happens between you and your co-founder, who owns that product? Because the entity didn't buy it because the entity wasn't in existence yet. So you get into some weird situations like that. Also, just in my opinion, especially if you have co-founders or other business partners that you're working with, those relationships, as I'm sure y'all know, ebb and flow, right? I mean, they have their ups and their downs, just like any other relationship, close, intimate relationship. And the beginning of a business is when everyone's excited. It's when everyone's in a good mood. The world hasn't really got you down yet. Not to say that's gonna happen.
Getting nervous over here, Jessica.
I got sweat on my forehead.
It's all rainbows and sunshine. Sometimes I talk to people and they're like, Jessica, I hate talking to you. You're so depressing. And then sometimes I talk to people and they're like, oh, you're so happy. And I'm like, yeah, just wait. But yeah, getting all of that documentation and stuff out of the way before something happens with the business is really important, because honestly, I have seen businesses fall apart before they even get started. And that can be a nightmare to deal with, because now you don't have an entity, you have no documentation as to how anything related to the business was going to be handled. And you have to go to court to argue about a business that never even really came to fruition. It's such a waste of time and it's such a waste of money. And the entire situation can be avoided by just filing the entity as soon as possible. So, like I said, we still need a signal. I know it's being recorded, but you can just wrap it up, Jessica. This answer has been too long.
No, that was actually great.
Very good.
It's a good point. I mean, specifically for people who have co-founders, just to simplify everything in case, things don't work out the way it should, then, you save a lot of headache.
Yeah. Well, and I hear all the time from people, oh, I'm not worried about my co-founder. They're my brother, sister, spouse, religious leader from when I was 8 years old, insert super close relationship here. But I see businesses and business owners split up every day. And that doesn't necessarily mean something negative happened, right? I mean, you can run a business for 30 years at some point in that 30 years, the likelihood that one of the founders is just going to want to do something different with their life is pretty high. So if that relationship really is important to you, the best thing you can do is have documentation for it, because then it doesn't have to become this super emotional, super negative thing for the relationship. We can just point to the document and go, okay, we don't have to argue about this. We don't have to yell at each other. We just have to do what the document says. And you can kind of step back emotionally from it, which in my experience preserves that relationship.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So since you brought up forming legal entities, let's get to the really fun part. Can you just briefly, I know this could go on forever if we want to really get deep into it, but kind of like go over the most common forms of legal entities and briefly like give us some pros and cons of each one.
So I teach business law as well, and I normally teach it in a sliding scale.
Okay.
So I'll use the same scale because it's quick. You start with a sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorship is not actually an entity. The concept of sole proprietorship itself, it's getting tough, is really just the lack of an entity. So it means we're doing business, or I'm doing business as an individual, but I don't actually have an entity. Sole proprietorships provide you no liability protection. There's no distinction of assets between my assets and the business's assets. So you have a lot of personal liability, and it creates a lot of instability and potential uncertainty for the business. But the benefits of it are you don't file anything, you just start doing business. It's very easy, straightforward, to the point, which is why a lot of people do it. The next step up from that is a partnership, some form of partnership. And there are various forms depending on what state you're in: limited partnerships, general partnerships, limited liability partnerships. I'm just going to classify all of these as partnerships.
Okay.
Partnerships are kind of the next step up. You do generally have to file. In the state of Texas, you can choose not to file in certain situations, or you can choose to file. But there is generally some filing component, but it's not as formal or as tedious as other entity types. So it does provide you some tangible entity. You do actually have an entity with the state. You will be taxed as a pass-through. So it's just going to be passed through to the partner's personal income. There's not really any distinction for tax purposes. The partnership management guidelines are normally pretty relaxed. They tend to be more informal. There are some rules governing management structure and all of that, but they're not very comprehensive generally. So that's kind of like our mid-range, right? Then we get to LLCs, limited liability companies. And I think it's really important to say companies there, because a lot of people want to say corporations. And that technicality is actually a very big deal. So for example, in the state of Texas, if I hold out to someone that I'm a corporation or I'm incorporated and I am not, that's actually a violation of the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. So that verbiage is very important. Limited liability company, LLC, is kind of, in my opinion, has the best of both worlds, of both a corporation and a partnership. You get to manage and internally structure and run the LLC as informally or formally as you want. So you do have that kind of intuitive management aspect that a partnership has. But you get the full kind of liability protection and tax options that a corporation has. An LLC, you can choose to be taxed in a variety of ways, some of which are partnership pass-through based, some of which are corporate based. So you have flexibility, and from a tax perspective, it gives you some wiggle room to grow as the revenue of the business grows, which is nice. But you're not subjecting yourself to the full corporate formalities for internal governing. And I'll talk about those in a corporation. So, and just one more second for the LLC, I think there's a common misconception that there are limitations on who can own an LLC, how you can split up the shares or percentage ownership in an LLC. And at least in the state of Texas, like I said, and in most states, that's not accurate. You can split up an LLC ownership however you want. You can have an entity with ownership in an LLC. Sorry, my dog's there. You can have an entity with ownership in an LLC. You can split that ownership up over time using a vesting schedule, just like you would with shares in a corporation. You can do pretty much anything you want with it. So it really is a flexible entity choice. And then we get to corporations, which is the most formal. It is the most structured. It has the most comprehensive filings. But the reason for all of that is you can do a lot with it, and it provides you a lot of protection. So if your company plans to go public at some point, you will need to be a corporation. There are certain tax benefits and certain revenue points, which is not what I'm here to talk about, but I'm sure someone else can talk about it. Certain revenue points you hit where it makes sense to actually be taxed as a corporation as opposed to a pass-through entity. So all of those sorts of things. And there are certain investors, if you're in an industry that may potentially be looking for investors, there are certain investors that prefer corporate entity types to other less formal types of entities, be it because they're misunderstood or the laws in their state may not be as favorable to other entity types. And so there's just kind of a myth there. Whatever the reason is, there are some investors that prefer corporate entities. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But the formalities for running a corporation are significantly more stringent. So it's not, in most cases, you can't just have a meeting. You need resolutions, you need shareholder meetings, you need the structure internally of how the business is run is very important.
I see. And how easy is it? Let's say if a company is formed as an LLC and then later on they need to change that entity to a corporation, how hard or easy is that process?
That depends really drastically on two things. One, are you converting within the same state? So am I trying to go from a Texas LLC to a Texas corporation, or am I trying to go from a Texas LLC to a Delaware corporation? That's obviously a little more difficult than just a lateral in-state transfer. But really the majority of that answer depends on what state you're in. There are certain states where you cannot transfer out of state. So your only options would be to shut down the existing entity and transfer all of those assets to a new entity. In Texas, it's not really that difficult. Obviously, changing from a Texas LLC to a Texas corporation is a little less tedious than changing to an out-of-state corporation, but it is possible in most states, but you do need to check with your local state regulations because there are certain states, some big states that people file in and do a lot of business in where that is not possible to convert to a foreign corporation. So something to be aware of on the front end. And that's the type of stuff that people need to research because you don't have to form where you personally are located. You can form anywhere in the United States, theoretically in the world. I don't know why you do that, but there are certain reasons you would do that. But focusing on the United States, you can form anywhere in the United States. I can't even honestly get a thought out in my head without being like, well, it depends. That's not 100% true.
Life of a lawyer.
Yeah, right. I can't even get my own sentences out. But yeah, it's pretty easy in most states.
Actually, speaking of states, from your experience, is there a state that has significantly better benefits in terms of tax or liability?
Yeah. So the big myth, it's funny, I actually just did a video on this. The big myth has always been that you need to be a Delaware C Corp. And that literally makes me want to bang my head against my desk every time I hear that. It had validity back in the day, decades ago, when that myth kind of first sprung up. And I think some historical context is important. That happened because Delaware had very favorable and progressive laws at the time, and Delaware has a specialized court system that deals only with business law, which means the process tends to be expedited in terms of having to interact with the court system. And the individuals in that court system are very familiar with dealing with businesses. So you're not having to deal with a judge that also does criminal law and family law and all these other things.
Right.
And dealing with a judge who knows the subject matter can really make or break a case. So, there's some benefits there. But as other states have seen over the years, the great things that did for the Delaware economy and business development, they've started to adopt their own rules. Like I said, I'm based in Texas, so Texas has very favorable laws for businesses. I very rarely advise a company to be a Delaware C Corp over a Texas LLC or a Texas corporation. There are certain states where being a Delaware C Corp or incorporating in another state may be better. For example, California's business entity laws tend to be really stringent. They're overtaxed. They're really difficult in terms of trying to convert the entities or trying to convert them out of California, especially. And so if you were in California, it makes much more sense to be a Delaware C Corp. That's what the majority of investors are used to working with, and their tax and administration laws are just easier to manage. But being in a state like Texas, we have favorable court systems, we have favorable tax provisions. Our entity and structuring laws are almost identical to Delaware's in most instances. So there's not really a reason for a business in a state like Texas to incorporate someplace else, unless there are certain exceptions for, like, if you're planning to go public in the next 2 months or something along those lines, then there are additional benefits in other states that you may want to consider. But for the average business owner that's not at 100 million in revenue a year and doing an IPO in the next 2 months, you're probably okay in Texas.
Go Texas.
Yay.
The Lone Star.
I know. I had to tell someone on LinkedIn the other day. A friend of mine was like, "Oh, I'm gonna start my next company in Texas." And he's based in California, and I was like, "We would love to have you. I promise the state is not paying me to say this, but I should be getting paid for that. If the state of Texas wants to pay me for that, I'm not against it."
Good idea. We're gonna share that with them.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm sure they'll jump at the opportunity.
Just one quick question. I keep hearing this. I don't think it's new, but like maybe a little bit more popular recently. What about B Corps?
Yeah.
What are the benefits or the advantages of a B Corp versus a regular?
Yeah, B Corps are an entity type that popped up to deal with kind of the social conscious, the conscious capitalism movement. And essentially it blends the corporate structure, yet it allows a corporate entity to adopt into its internal governance processes the purpose for which it was formed. There are tax benefits that I'll allow a CPA to discuss, and you should consider those. Talk to a CPA if you are running some sort of socially conscious business. It's kind of an interesting mix of like a nonprofit perspective and a corporate perspective. From an internal governance and structuring perspective, like I said, it sounds like a little thing, being able to incorporate your purpose into how the company is governed. But that really is a huge thing, right? Because the underlying philosophy of most business structures is that my duty to the company is to maximize profit. That is the lens through which I have to look at every decision I make as an officer, as a board member, as a shareholder, whatever. And to the extent that I am not maximizing profit, I'm potentially making a decision that's not in the best interest of the company, which I could be held accountable for in the legal system. And so being able to incorporate that purpose and allow a company to prioritize that purpose just like they prioritize profits really does kind of shake up the dynamics, the internal governance dynamics of a corporation. And there are a lot more nuances and intricacies and conversations to be had about public and private partnerships that can happen with B Corps that can't necessarily happen with some other companies. There are also limitations on the types of companies in some states that can be a B Corp. But if you're participating in some sort of socially conscious company, I don't like to tell people just jump straight to a B Corp without taking anything else into account. But it is something you should have a conversation with your counsel about.
That's good. I actually didn't know about B Corps at all. So good
B
point you
Corps
brought
are
up.
really popular actually here in San Francisco, at least. If
Yeah.
Of course.
even a tech company trying to do something like you have a bigger mission, they usually tend to have at least a B Corp certification, which I don't really know what the difference between. Is it the same thing?
Yeah, so the entity type itself gained traction in the Northeast, and then it's slowly kind of been working its way south and west. But I don't know the last count. I believe when Texas created its B Corp status, there was maybe 12 other states that had allowed B Corp status, which don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure. But, we were kind of at the beginning of it. To answer your question about the difference between certification, it kind of depends. There's a difference from a tax perspective, and I literally said it depends. Oh my gosh, the worst lawyer ever. I'm officially like every other lawyer. It does depend. There's a difference for tax purposes, for state entity purposes, and then certain types of certifications for partnerships with government entities and for partnerships with business entities, similar to how you can be certified veteran owned or certified minority owned. There are organizations which provide that certification after they've looked over the internal governance and structuring and membership and whatnot. So it varies what that actually means.
I see. That's good to know, really. Especially, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, I know that face. That face is Jessica. There's so much information. I'm just trying to like, okay, cool. Yeah,
You might see smoke coming out of my head here in a second.
As long as it's not anger smoke,
Yeah.
then I'm fine with it.
It's not anger.
No, definitely not. I mean, it's a lot of good information and good advice that you wouldn't get. I mean, you would have to search for hours and read on articles. So this is really great.
Yeah.
I do want to shift the conversation a little bit towards documentation and contracts.
Great.
So
yeah,
give us like your top 3 tips. This could be sort of general in any type of contract or any kind of legal documentation that founders could be preparing with their legal counsel. What are the most important things to pay attention to?
I think if I'm going to pick my top 3, I think 1 is making sure that you have your internal governance documents in order. And by that, I mean your state filings, your agreements with your co-founders about how the company is going to be run. All of that sort of stuff, kind of the nuts and bolts of how the company operates. So that documentation is really important, number 1. Number 2 is your intellectual property documents. So if you are planning to get a patent, a trademark, a copyright, something along those lines, getting all of that documentation sorted out and properly applied for and keeping it all up to date and in order is really important. And along those same lines, when we talk about intellectual property, also those ownership documents like we talked about earlier. So making sure that anyone who has been working on the product or the technology or whatever it is has assigned their work to the company, so the company actually owns it. In certain situations it's necessary. In certain situations you could argue maybe it's not, but it's better to be safe than sorry. And if you are planning to seek investment at some point, that documentation related to does the company actually own the intellectual property is going to be something that investors are looking for. And third would be your agreements between the company and your contractors and employees. That's extremely important because there's a common misconception that you can just slap the title contractor onto someone and suddenly they're a contractor, and that's just not true. One of the honestly more complex business topics is, when is someone an employee and when is someone a contractor? Because there are all these different definitions. The IRS has its own definition. Your state workforce agency probably has its own definition. The federal workforce agencies have their own definition. And so making sure that you fall in line with all of those definitions is really important, because you don't want to run afoul of the tax laws, employment laws, things like that. So you use the documents to really solidify that relationship, and also you use them to protect your intellectual property, mitigate your company's risk, set out minimum policies and expectations. So another mistake that I see a lot of companies make is, they want to cultivate this culture of like being relaxed and formal and we work from home or wherever it is. And that's cool, man. You do you. But making sure that you have policies in there about sexual harassment and what type of language and behavior is going to be tolerated. Technology usage policies. So maybe you're cool with everyone working from home, but that doesn't mean you're cool with them working from a Starbucks off unsecured Wi-Fi while they're working on confidential information.
Right.
And also, if you have clients or, you have vendors that you work with as a company, you may be required to include some provisions in your employer contractor agreements. So you may not just be creating risk and liability between yourself and your contractors and employees, but you may be creating liability for a client or a vendor or someone along those lines. So making sure that you maintain all of those obligations is really important. And breathe.
Pause. Pause.
I like it.
I do have a follow-up question on the second point. Yeah. So when you say that each member of the initial team who's working on the product or the services or whatever the company is built around needs to assign their work to the business entity, what do you mean by that? So like, let's say me and Panis are forming a business to be a media company, and I'm sending 20 emails a day. Like, do I have to somewhere mention that these emails sent from this email address are like, what type of work should you assign to your business entity is my question.
Yeah. So anything that you create, really, I mean, copyrights for the most part can cover anything, right? And as soon as I create content, I am the owner of it. Unless I am under agreement or have otherwise assigned it to someone else, I am the owner of it. So if I start a marketing company and before we form the entity, I have created Facebook accounts for 10 clients. Absent agreements with those clients, I own those Facebook accounts. I can do whatever I want with those Facebook accounts. And there are a lot of instances, especially in like social media influencer marketing, where those things have not been properly assigned, and the analyst or whoever's working on it leaves, and they're like, I'm taking your page that I built up 10 million followers for, I'm switching all the branding, and I'm not giving you the passwords for it. And they're perfectly within their rights to do that if they created it and you don't have a document saying that you as the company or they as the client own that information.
I see. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that sort of stuff. Yeah, that sort of stuff is important. Sometimes I talk to people and you can just see in their head they're running over like everything they've done. That's like the story. I literally do that on a daily basis. It's like the story of my life. But yeah, I have to tell people, like you said earlier, just like pause. Don't panic. We're not having a panic conversation right now. It's probably fine. That's something to keep in mind.
Okay. Well, I think this is a good segue to get into, registering trademarks, especially when you're building a brand. So tell us a little bit more about what recommendations you have for businesses that are building brands, and, do you recommend them actually trademarking that brand as, registering that trademark?
Yeah, I definitely think, and I think any investor you talk to or the statistics around it would tell you that intellectual property is definitely a valuable asset of any business. So it's not to be underestimated. I wouldn't ever tell a company, if you are consistently using a name, a logo, some sort of branding or marketing design, whatever it is, not to trademark, copyright, patent, whatever those things. It's part of a good long-term business strategy to make sure that those things are protected. And it should be a priority of a business in the long run. My caveat to that, which always, I just know there's going to be a horde of intellectual property attorneys that like, you are the worst. I totally disagree with you. You don't know what you're talking about. And that's fine. I've heard it before. But as someone who works a lot with early to mid-stage companies, I see time and time again, companies start with one name or one logo, and then 6 months in, 9 months in, there's something else. Yeah, I mean, everyone, it happens to the majority of companies. I did it too. And so what I caution people on is, if you are going to invest the money to get a trademark, a copyright, whatever it is, a patent, make sure that you are committed to that intellectual property. If you are planning to do market testing on something, or you want to run focus groups, or you like the logo but you're not really committed to in the long run, I don't think it's worth the money to pursue it, because trademarks can take 6 to 9 months to hear back from the USPTO, and I've seen companies abandon the trademark before they've even heard back from the USPTO. So it's an expensive endeavor, and it has value once you know that particular intellectual property actually has value to you.
So maybe don't do that the first thing. Once you start working, maybe wait a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. And something else to keep in mind, website names, domain names are not covered by trademarks. So just because I have the trademark to Starbucks does not mean that you cannot go out and purchase starbucks.com, and then I have to send you, or you have to comply with a cease and desist saying you can't use this domain, you have to give it to me because I have the trademark. That is not accurate. And occasionally you'll see cease and desist letters that say that, among other things. But just know there's a difference between domain names and trademarks, and domain names are generally, that's a generalization, but generally not included in your trademark protection.
Is there some other sort of document that someone can file for to protect like a specific domain name, or there's no such thing?
Well, it's really about what they're doing with the domain name. So if they were using, say that I had the trademark for Starbucks, someone else purchased starbucks.com, and they were purposefully targeting my traffic, and then doing something similar with that domain name that overlapped or infringed on my trademark, then you could potentially have some sort of cause or claim against them. But if they're selling bicycles off starbucks.com and they're not at all targeting my demographic, or purposely trying to mislead people to get to their site thinking that it's my site, then that's kind of the scenario that's not impacted. So once again, all generalizations, but just for some basic information.
Trademarks are important.
Trademarks are important. Patents can be important too. Investors love tangible intellectual property. Huge value add. I'm sure, y'all know, being in kind of that area geographically, everyone loves some tangible property rights. Because, if nothing else, even if the company goes bust and is worth nothing, maybe someone still wants the name Starbucks.
Right.
That itself has value. So it's like having tangible products without actually having any tangible products.
Interesting. Since we kind of touched on patents. I feel like we could go on and on about talking about it, but we should probably skip that one. What do you think, Shasta? We kind of
Yeah,
talked
I
about
agree.
it.
I feel like patents, if we go down that rabbit hole, it'd be a hard climb back up.
Yeah.
We're just on that train.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about some tips and advice you have on legal documents when adding a new team member.
Yeah. I think first getting your contractor employee agreement is super important. And then second, making sure you've communicated, ideally in the form of like an employee handbook, all of your policies, procedures, all of that sort of stuff. The reason being that most major employment laws don't require you to comply until you hit a certain number of employees, and that varies depending on regulation. So it's not like you get one employee and then suddenly you're subject to every employment law in the world or in the continental United States. But it's a good practice to get into the habit of creating policies and procedures. One of the only areas of litigation that's been on the rise in the past 15 years is employment related litigation. And one of the easiest ways to avoid that is policy and procedure. And especially young founders or technology companies, it's very counter to their culture to want to have procedures and policies for things. And I get that, right? You know, I work with a lot of young founders and tech companies. I don't want to come in and destroy your culture. I get, you know, the vibe is different and you're trying not to be corporate and you're trying to do all these things. And protecting that culture has a value and is important. But there are also certain areas where it is really important to the integrity of the business to have policies and procedures in place. And most of those focus around things like I said, how are you handling discriminatory practices within the workplace? How are you handling equal opportunity employment? How are you handling sexual harassment in the workplace? Or a hostile work environment, which could mean anything, you know, racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination or inappropriate conduct that maybe are making people uncomfortable. And, you know, what I tell founders is that kind of stuff is not your culture. You know, maybe you feel like you don't want to create a bunch of policies because you don't want to be corporate. And I get that. But those policies are really attacking the negative aspects of corporate culture that you are really seeking to keep out of your business so that you can thrive and, you know, allow creativity and communication between teams. So having policies for all of that sort of stuff. And like I said, technology policies are important, really important, especially if you're handling sensitive information or if you're working in an area that handles regulated information like education, healthcare, something along those lines. So yeah, an employee handbook I think is imperative, or some version of it. And then also, yeah, that employee agreement, contractor agreement, just to address those things we've already discussed, which is salary, benefits, minimum expectations, status, and intellectual property ownership.
All right. So get your employee handbook in check before you hire anyone.
I know. Well, and they can be, you know, every attorney has their own drafting style, right? So like things don't have to be written in complex legalese. That's generally a strategy that people who are trying to hide things use because they assume people will get tired of reading it.
Right.
And also lawyers,
right? People, 90% will, including myself. I'm like, oh, just agree, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. And people, you know, lawyers get money for sounding fancy, and they like that their clients don't know what it says. And that's honestly like part of it, right? Is it increases a firm's billable hours if you as the client don't even know what your own document says and you have to call me to ask, because you better believe I'm charging you for that call. Not me personally, but like a big firm. And so find an attorney that does, or, you know, if you don't want your attorney to draft in legalese, ask them not to. Tell them just to draft in plain language. There are certain provisions which have to have certain language, either required by regulation or case law, whatever the situation may be. So that can always be effectuated, but the vast majority of situations, you can draft an employee handbook that does not want to make your employee like stab their eye out with a fork while they're reading it. It can be like kind of amusing if you want it to be.
Yeah, no, that's really great advice. Because I mean, as Pawnee's mentioned earlier, mostly founders and entrepreneurs, especially early on, are not really thinking about these things. They're just trying to keep their head above water and keep the company running.
100%.
So I know that we are past the top of the hour. So is there any other tips or advice for our audience if they did not take anything from this session? What is the one thing you want to make sure everyone takes away?
If they listen 2 minutes in, they're like, no, I can't handle her. I think the most important thing is find legal counsel quickly, establish that relationship quickly, and find someone that you connect with. Because here's the biggest thing. I talk to people all the time who say, oh, my other attorney like made me nervous, or they tried to intimidate me, or I felt like they were judging me because of the things I said. And if you cannot talk to your attorney, you are working with the wrong attorney. If you don't feel comfortable around your attorney, you are working with the wrong attorney, because I can only be as effective as the information that my clients give me. So if you're not telling me half the story because you don't want to get yelled at, or you don't want to see like my disappointed face, then I'm only going to be 50% productive, right? I can only be so effective. And you know, some people need that $1,500 an hour fancy marble building downtown $5,000 suit attorney, and some people don't, and that's fine. Don't buy into this concept that you have to go to a big firm that's charging you excessive amounts of money because of the name. You know, those firms have a place. I don't at all want to hate on them, because they're very experienced and very nuanced things. And that's has a value. But the average business owner, it is significantly more important for you to find someone you connect with and can build a long-term relationship with than it is for you to go to a big name firm. Because you're going to be a small client on the totem pole, and you're not going to get the attention you deserve, because that's just, you know, the way the economics of a law firm works. So if you take nothing else out of this, just find someone that you trust and that you connect with and that specializes in the topic area, and have an honest conversation with them, and they'll tell you everything I already said.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Very, very informative. Definitely.
Awesome.
All of these points you made makes me want to talk to Shahzad and
Great.
You know, sometimes you just have to hear, you know, the legalities, and you know, it's really interesting, because up until the point that you're actually starting to either work with someone else, or you know, you're trying to actually deliver on your side project, you start realizing that, holy shit, this is like, I have to form this as a, you know, I need to be legit. I can't be just this. And mainly
this like floating
talking
around
about us right now.
Yeah.
No, but that's important. Like, people don't really appreciate that who you're choosing to do business with is just as important a legal relationship as who you marry. Because getting out of that relationship is going to be just as, you know, tedious and emotional and time consuming as getting out of a marriage. So don't just rush into a business relationship with someone because it seems like a good idea in the moment. Like, if I had married all the guys I thought it was a good idea to marry in the moment, that would be illegal because you can only be married to one person at a time. So
Yeah.
Well, thank
just
you
keep
so
that.
much, Jessica.
Yes.
Seriously,
Yeah,
this was really
definitely.
helpful. I know
Thanks
that
for
for
the
sure we're
invite.
probably going to have a session 2 down the
Yeah,
line.
definitely.
Once our listeners get an understanding of the basics
Yeah.
and send us more advanced questions, I'm sure that, we're going to approach you again, and
Great.
if you're open to it, we're going to have
Yeah.
sessions for more advanced legal
I
advice.
love
But
it.
at the same
Definitely.
time, until then, this has been really informative, and we would
Great.
actually love to share your information with those folks that are interested in getting in touch with you to talk about everything we talked about specifically for their businesses. So tell us how they can reach out to you, and we're also going to include some links in our the details below that
Awesome.
episode.
Yeah. So the easiest way to connect with me is probably on LinkedIn, as y'all know, at Jessica Vittorio, and I won't spell it because y'all will put it down there. But Jessica Vittorio. You can find me on Instagram at Jess_Vittorio. I also have a podcast, which is
cool.
not as good or consistent. The first thing everyone says is, when was the last time you put out an episode? But I do have a podcast that discusses kind of general business concepts. It's called Shit Your Lawyer Says. And
love that name.
Yeah, thanks. It's on Google TuneIn or Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, or not Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. So yeah, they can check that out if they just want some like general information on some of the stuff I discussed. Also, I'll give you my website address, www.lawofficeofjessicavittorio.com.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. This was fun. I appreciate it. And feel free to reach out. Like if people, email, if there's like a mass comment of questions, I'm happy to like reach out and answer some questions. So just let me know, because I probably won't keep track of myself. But if you shoot me a message and you're like, hey Jessica, there's a ton of questions down there, I'm happy to clarify or whatever. So
sounds great.
Sure, will do. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks.